Well, friends, it's been an interesting first week of the semester. Here we are, I guess, having class today, even though it's snowing outside, all those sorts of things. Really sorry for how things have gone so far early this semester. We had our introductory day last Wednesday, a full week away from today. I've been battling illness, so we missed class on Friday, MLK Day Monday, the snowpocalypse of 2018 going on as we speak, and by Friday I think it's supposed to be in the 60s. So it certainly has been a crazy first few days of the semester. Thanks for your patience and for bearing with me and my illness and those sorts of things. It has not been a fun journey. But we continue to sort of get through it as best we can. What I wanted to do today, just as I've looked at the syllabus, losing multiple days just is not going to work in terms of fitting everything in that we need to fit in this semester. And so what I'm going to do today is sort of give this video lecture, if you will. So yeah, this one counts. This will be on your first exam, all those sorts of things. The PowerPoint is available to you if you want to follow along. The PowerPoint is available to you on Blackboard. Should be the first PowerPoint that you come to there under a tab that says PowerPoints, and it's called Old Testament OT Intro. And so that's sort of what we want to do today, is talk about some introductory matters, so that on Friday we can sort of have this behind us and move on to some other things without having to cram so much in a couple of days that we really don't have time to cover anything well. So I appreciate your patience with this venue. Welcome to my home. By the way, if you've added the course even since Wednesday, I'm Eddie Stepp. I'm your professor this semester, and sorry that this has to be our first meeting, but I look forward to being back in the classroom together on Friday and getting to see you again, those sorts of things. So yeah, our PowerPoint today sort of takes us through some introductory issues. We'll ask questions about what the Bible is, just so we've got sort of a clear understanding. What exactly is the Old Testament? And then we're going to talk about some things related to the formation of the Old Testament canon, which is sort of an interesting backstory to essentially asking, how did we get the books that we have in the Old Testament, and how did that process come to be? And another reason I guess you may want this PowerPoint in front of you is, as you'll notice with some of the PowerPoints that I use through the semester, and some days we'll have them and some days we won't, but this one in particular has several blanks, and so it's sort of a fill-in-the-blank sort of thing as you move along, and so that's why I think it would probably be helpful to have the PowerPoint in front of you, so if nothing else, you can at least write down some of the correct answers that fill in those blanks, so that you'll be better prepared come exam time. So I guess our first question, one of the first slides that you'll come to, asks the question about what is the Bible. I guess I think we need to start there with that conversation, and then sort of narrow our focus to the Old Testament. The Bible is, as we typically will refer to it, refers to both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So it's the authoritative writings of the Christian Church. Christians have taken for themselves both the Old Testament, which is the Hebrew Bible, the Bible of the Jewish people, but they've also added writings to it the Christian community has over time, which has become the New Testament, stories about Jesus, those sorts of things. And it's the bringing of those two together is what we call the Bible in the Christian church. It's one book, but there's lots of little books, thus sort of the Latin root biblia, which comes from the word books. So we're dealing with lots of little books that make up this one big book. In particular, there are 66 books in the entire Bible. 66 of them. 39 of them are in the Old Testament, sometimes called the Old Covenant. 27 of the books are in the New Testament. And so not quite evenly divided. If you have a Bible, you'll notice that the Old Testament is probably makes up 2/3 of the Bible, where the final third, or maybe a little bit more, is the New Testament itself. So when we think about Bible, we've got Old Testament and New Testament. And in particular, for our class this semester, obviously those 39 books will be what we're focusing on together this semester. Folks would maybe debate or have a discussion about it if there is a theme that sort of connects all of the Bible together. And I think my argument would be that the theme is a theme of salvation that connects sort of from the very beginning stories all the way through the stories at the very end of the New Testament. That the unifying theme that sort of holds the Bible together it's about God wanting, it's about God wanting to save his people. God wanting to have a relationship with his people. And so how can God do that? What are the steps that God's going to take in order to save humans, to rescue humans from others, from themselves, from their own inclinations, those sorts of things. And so we see ways that God saves his people through the Old Testament. Moses coming and getting the people out of slavery in Egypt. There's a legal system that's set up with commandments to follow in the Old Testament. That's part of the saving process. God wants the people to be able to have a role in their own salvation. We see that doesn't work very well, and it builds into the New Testament where there are new opportunities put in place for salvation to be discovered. And so I think that theme of salvation is the one that for me, as much as anything, sort of traces through the entire story. Well, excuse me again. As you can see, the cold hasn't quite let go of its hold on me just yet. The next slide that we come to, we're thinking about what the Old Testament is in particular. And you'll note right off the bat, sometimes we will use the language Old Testament. Sometimes we'll use the language of Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible. We're talking about the same thing. Old Testament is more of a Christian term. Hebrew Bible or Jewish Bible is more of a Jewish term. And since these books and these texts initially belonged to the Jewish community, I think it's important for us to recognize both sides of those. So what do we have when we think about the Old Testament? Sort of the blank that I've got you to fill in here is the big word anthology. I like to think of the Old Testament as an anthology of sacred stories of the Jewish people. In literature, sometimes you run into anthologies, sort of a bringing together the greatest writings of a certain author. And I think there is a sense in which the Old Testament is the most important writings that have been brought together by the Jewish community. Over time, over history, these were collected. They weren't all written at the same time. They weren't written all by the same person. They cover a wide range of time, in fact. And part of my argument today is that these writings, written in different periods, in different places, in different locations, all get collected together later and brought together in what we have and what we know of as the Old Testament. So there's lots of different types of literature here. There's historical narrative, there's legal code, there's prophetic utterances, there's wisdom literature, there's poetry, there's songs. All these different types of literature are part of what makes the Old Testament so unique, I think, because of all the differences that do exist in the Old Testament. So we have these very unique 39 books. We'll be looking at the vast majority of them together this semester and trying to see what they say, because I think as they tell this story of salvation, they're not only interesting documents from a historical and a faith perspective, but I think they're also important because of what they continue to tell us and continue to teach us about life with God. So our next slide will take us to this idea of canon, C-A-N-O-N. So we're not thinking about the guns here. We're thinking about canon is sort of a specific term in literature and certainly used a lot in biblical studies. A canon refers to literally a rule or a measure. If you think of like a yardstick could be a type of measuring stick, a measuring device. That's what we're thinking about when we think about canon. But obviously we're not thinking about measuring out something literally, how long is something. But canon in this sense is used to describe books that fit a certain standard, that fit a certain, they fit within a certain parameters or certain specifications. And here, as we think about the Old Testament books, we're thinking about books that fit within the early Jewish community, their stories of their faith, books that they found important enough to include in this list. These are the books that are authoritative. These are the books that are valued. These are not the only books that the Jewish community ever wrote, but these 39 that find their way into the Old Testament canon are deemed most significant. There were other books that were written that, probably lots of people read, but they didn't make the status of canon or canonical, as it's sometimes referred to. Now, when we think about the Old Testament and the coming together of the texts that we have, we need to think about two different types of canon. One of them that I've referred to here, this first one, is called the Hebrew or the Palestinian canon. And then we'll talk about another one in a minute that emerges in a different location, in a different place. Different language even is a part of that story. So this Hebrew canon, this Palestinian canon, emerges in Palestine. It emerges in what we'll think of as Israel or the Promised Land. There were Jews who were living there who, as time went on, they were like, we need to come up with this collection of writings that best defines who we are and our faith, and so that we can pass it on to future generations. And so different things that had been written began to show up, and they began to collect them and use them in a worship setting, and that's sort of how the process rolls along. So when we think about canon in particular, there's three main sections to the Old Testament canon, to the Hebrew canon. They're listed on your PowerPoint. The Hebrew names, and then I can give you sort of their English equivalents here. So we're looking at the Torah, Now we're looking at Nebi'im, and we're looking at Ketubim. In Hebrew, these are the names of the three sections of the Hebrew canon. Torah refers to the law. This is the first 5 books. We'll say a little bit more about this on the next slide. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, these first 5 books of the Old Testament. They tell the stories of creation and Abraham and Moses, but they also give us the commandments, the laws that God passes on to his people. All of that is included in the Torah. For most Jews, this is the most important, the most authoritative section in their Bible. Nebi'im, we equate that with prophets. Prophets. We will see that there's a couple of different types of prophets, both written and non-written prophets, different types of stories that are going on here. We'll say more about that in just a minute. The third section, the Ketubim, refers to the writings. This is a collection of other types of literature that don't fit real neatly into the other categories, and so Ketubim becomes sort of a general category of lots of different types of literature. So we've got Torah, we've got Nebi'im, we've got Ketubim, law, prophets, and writings. And sometimes you may read in your textbook, there may be times that, excuse me, when we refer to the collection of writings as the Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K, T for Torah, N for Nevi'im, K for Ketubim. It's sort of a handy way that the Jews use to refer to the Bible as a whole. So in case that word comes up, you can be familiar with that as well. The next slide talks a little bit more about the Hebrew canon in particular, and we'll try to jump through this pretty quickly. I have the different sections of the Torah broken down for you. I'm sorry, not sections of the Torah, sections of the canon. Torah, prophets, and writings, with specific books that are in those particular sections. And so here in Torah, we've got these first 5 books. We've got the story of creation through the death of Moses. The people are about to enter the promised land. An important section. We'll be spending a lot of time there. The prophets, you'll notice that there are both what the Jews call former prophets and latter prophets. And then even within the latter prophets, you have major prophets and you have minor prophets. So different books are included here. and the ways that the Jews count their books is a little bit different than maybe you would find in a Christian Old Testament. For example, the Jews would just talk about the book of Samuel. It's all one book from a Jewish perspective. Well, from a Christian perspective, a Christian Old Testament, we would see 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. The book has been divided into 2. From a Jewish perspective, I only mention that because the way in which they add up the number of books in their canon is a little bit different. So we've got former prophets, we've got latter prophets, major prophets and minor prophets. All the minor prophets, there are 12 of them. I mentioned Hosea is the first one. Malachi is the last one that's mentioned. Decided not to write out all 12 minor prophets for you. You're welcome. All 12 of those prophets are considered one book by the Jewish community. They were all written on one scroll. That's typically how books were done in ancient times. And so because these books are not very long in length, all of them fit onto one scroll. and that's considered to be just one book. Sometimes they will call that the Book of the 12, thinking about the minor prophets. And then we've got the writings as well, which is a whole lot of different things. Psalms and Proverbs, and the book of Daniel falls in this category. Job and Esther and Ruth, some very interesting stories that we'll be talking about later. But they sort of have their own unique characteristics, and we'll be spending more time with that down the road. From a Jewish perspective, if you add it all up, what you end up with are 24 books in the Hebrew canon. 24 books in the Hebrew canon. Well, I thought there were 39 books in the Old Testament. Well, they are, but sort of how the Jews count their books and how Christians have divided the books leads to the difference in terms of numbers. So just so you can be aware of that, 24 books in the Hebrew canon, 39 books in the Christian Old Testament. All the books are the same. All the material is there. It's just how we sort of divide it up that makes the difference. Drink of water real quickly. At the beginning of the semester, I'm never used to talking very much, and it takes a little bit of time for the voice to get back into proclamation mode, if you will, and then throw a little sickness on top of that, and can feel it a little bit. Well, a couple more slides to go. Let's mention briefly the Alexandrian canon. The Hebrew canon was brought together geographically in Palestine. That is the Middle East, the land around Israel. So it's a geographically centered document. People are living there who are speaking Hebrew, who have a certain way of life, a certain way of worship that is really important to them as they begin to bring texts together that speak to them and to their situation. Meanwhile, there's a large group of Jews who had migrated at various points before the time of Jesus, 400, 300 years before the time of Jesus. The situation was such in the world that Jews had a lot of freedom to move, and a lot of them did. A lot of them left sort of their home country of Israel, and a lot of them moved a little bit south down to Egypt. Well, a city that had been founded there by the Greek Alexander the Great, which is called Alexandria, lots of Jews moved there because they had freedom to do so, and new life opportunities and those sorts of things, and they were interested in a new life and a new culture and some of those sorts of things, and so a lot of Jews moved to Alexandria. And over time, these Jews began to speak Greek. Their lives began to change. They began to worship in some slightly different ways. And for their very large Greek-speaking Jewish community, they started pulling together texts that were important to them. They wanted to have their own Bible, if you will, their own canon. And so they began pulling together those texts that were authoritative for their communities in Egypt. So part of what they produce around the year 250 is a Greek translation of what we would call the Old Testament. It's called the Septuagint. That's your blank, your first blank there. Septuagint is SEPTUAGINT. Septuagint, there's lots of things that we could say about that. for now, let's just say this is the Greek Old Testament. So it's like we've got a Hebrew Old Testament, a Hebrew Bible that's being sort of brought together in Hebrew-speaking country. And here in Alexandria, a Greek-speaking country, this is the Greek Jewish Bible that's being brought into play. The 24 books in the Hebrew canon, all 24 books are in the Greek canon. There is not huge difference, but there is some difference between the two. So all the 24 books that we talked about briefly just a minute ago on the previous slide, all of those books are in the Greek canon as well. But they do add some other books that are important for their Greek-speaking community. And so they add some additional books to their canon, and these books are called the Apocrypha. Apocrypha is Apocrypha, Apocrypha. And depending on your church tradition, if you grew up in Roman Catholic circles, you may have been exposed to the Apocrypha. The Roman Catholic Bible is drawn from the Alexandrian canon. And so the Apocrypha gets copied over. It becomes somewhat important to Catholic tradition. And those books are read often in Catholic worship setting. If you grew up in non-Catholic churches, Protestant churches, you maybe have heard of the Apocrypha, but have no idea really what it is, because Protestant churches, when Protestants broke away from Roman Catholics, they didn't go back to the Alexandrian canon to build their scripture. They went back to the Hebrew canon, and there's no Apocrypha there. And so Christians divide because Jews were geographically separated, and Bibles are formed in different ways based on culture and preference and lots of other things as well. And so we end up with this Greek we end up with this Greek canon, 24 books, but then additional Apocrypha. You have a Hebrew canon being formed in Israel with its 24 books, a lot of emphasis on Hebrew, written in Hebrew, those sorts of things. And so depending on sort of where you live, from a Jewish perspective at this time, depends, or it has a bearing on which of these two collections of Scripture are going to be authoritative for you. So it is a process that we find ourselves going through in order to get this collection of books that we're going to be studying together this semester. Which leads us to our next slide, talking about the process of canon formation. I don't know if you've ever thought about how the Bible was written. I think sometimes folks imagine that, it was a snowy January in 1200 BC, and somebody sat down and decided, I've got some extra time on my hands here, let me write the book of Numbers today, or whatever. Our best scholarship seems to indicate that's not the process that gives us this collection of Old Testament texts. But what we have is, over hundreds and hundreds of years, you end up with stories being told, written down, collected, edited, brought into their final form together. a lengthy process. Sometimes that makes people nervous because it feels like maybe God's not part of the process, that it seems very human in some ways. I guess for me, I see God at work all throughout the process, sort of bringing these texts together, that He wants His communities to have, to be able to read, to understand better, to ask questions better, and to wrestle with life better. So there are several stages in this canon formation process, and it begins with what I've called oral tradition. That's the blank for you to fill in. Oral tradition. I guess one of the things we need to keep in mind is that, according to most scholars and archaeologists and things of that sort, Hebrews, the Jewish people, really didn't have the ability to write down stories until well into their history. Let's hypothetically say that Abraham lived somewhere around the year 2000 BC, or BCE if you prefer. Writing was not a significant option within the Jewish community for about 1,000 years after that. And so one of the things we have to think about is Abraham living in 2000, he's an illiterate shepherd who moves with his animals according to seasons and all those sorts of things. He's not sitting down writing diaries at the end of the day. He's not doing those sorts of things. But he's passing on stories to the next generation. And they pass on stories to the next generation. And this is sort of hard for us because we're not an oral culture. We are a culture driven by text and image and those sorts of things. And so I think it's hard for us to see the value of oral cultures who are expert storytellers, who remember details with fascinating degrees of accuracy over lengthy periods of time. And so I think one of the things we have to think about is that Hebrew culture early on was an oral culture. Stories get passed down orally for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's only after those years pass, education becomes more of an opportunity as the nation develops a little further, that you get specific individuals who have the ability to come along and say, we need to write down these stories. And so that begins their process. Priests become very important in that process of remembering and writing down those stories. But even then, that's not necessarily the final document itself. Those stories get still sort of shipped down the line, and it's up to others to sort of bring together and weave the stories together. And now we've got all these stories about Abraham. How are we going to fit them together into a narrative that tells the story of Abraham? And so we pull together all of these stories into a coherent whole, sort of an editing process, if you will, almost a cut and paste process that gives us this final form, this final collection of stories about Abraham that we then fit into this larger collection of stories about Abraham and his descendants, and how does this all fit together? And so it's quite a process that the Jewish leaders engage in for hundreds of years before we finally say, here is the book of Genesis, if you will. And so it's, the word I keep using, and the word that I hope that will sort of stick with you for now, even if maybe it makes you a little uncomfortable or you haven't thought about it before, is to think about the process. And depending on sort of your personal convictions and growing up and some of those sorts of things, that may make you a little bit uncomfortable, but it's important, I think, to at least consider it as an option that helps us to understand a little bit more the length of time that transpired to get us to the point where we have these documents in place. And you'll notice on the PowerPoint that I've mentioned there for you that because this is such a process, we've got the 3 sections of the Hebrew canon. The Torah, the first section, most people think doesn't come into sort of its final form till about 400 BCE. I mean, that's 1,000 years after many of its stories were first told. You've got prophets coming along a little bit later, the writings probably not even in their final form until after the time of Jesus. So that it's probably into the 1st century before we can really talk about a final Old Testament or Hebrew Bible being in place. So one of the ways that this will have a bearing, and we'll talk about this more in an upcoming class, is to think about sort of the complexity of this process and the number of translations that we end up with, and all of these sorts of things that make studying the Old Testament such an interesting process. Well, the final slide for the day asks the question of why these books. How did these 39 books, if we're counting them from our perspective, 39 books in the Old Testament, 24 books if we're counting from the Hebrew canon, how did these books become acceptable? How is it that these sort of made the cut, if you will, and other books did not make the cut? Because we know that there were other books written within the Jewish community, and we know that they had lots of literature available to them at various points in time. Why these books and not other books? A couple of factors worth thinking about. First off, when was the book written? From a Hebrew perspective, the book has greater authority if in their perspective it's written before the year 400. So basically, the earlier the book was written, the better. There's some exceptions to the rule that we'll see along the way, but generally, earlier date is more authoritative. So that the later that something gets written, the less likely it is to make its way into the canon. A second factor is the factor of language. What language was this text originally written in or compiled in? It needs to be written mainly in Hebrew. Hebrew is the language, the primary language of the Old Testament. 98%, 99% of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. There's a little bit that shows up in the language of Aramaic, but Hebrew is certainly the major text or the major language, and so things that are written, for example, in Greek, as we saw with the Alexandrian canon, those might be good for the Apocrypha, but the Hebrew canon, if we think about the Hebrew-speaking Jews who are living in Israel, they don't want anything to do with those Greek books. Those are a little too new, a little too modern. We want to keep our stuff in Hebrew as much as possible. A third factor is the extent of use, especially within the Jewish communities themselves. And this is not an easy thing to pinpoint. But were these books being used in worship? Did the Jewish community find them important? And if so, then they are more likely to be kept around. They are more likely to be valued. If we find that we really don't read this book and we keep pushing it to the side, then maybe it doesn't make the final canon. And then the fourth thing that I've mentioned in this particular list is the issue of authority. And there's a blank here to plug that word in, authority. Essentially, the question becomes, does God speak through these books? When we read a particular book in the Jewish community, in the worshiping, gathered community, do we believe that God speaks through these books? And typically, these books that make it into the Hebrew canon are those that are being used and read. We hear the voice of God. We are encouraged as we read these stories again and again and again, because God continues to speak to us through these stories. So that sense of authority that comes through these particular texts. And so what we end up with really at the end of the day is not that rabbis sat down with 60 options and voted. Everybody in favor of Genesis, raise your hand. Everybody loves Genesis, so in it goes. Voting some in and voting some out. I think it was a much more organic process than that. I think it was much more a much more fluid process. That's sort of hard for us because we miss some of the communal aspects that were so important in that time and in that culture, that allowed for dialogue and debate and disagreement, and then coming together around unified ideas to give us these particular books that make it. And I think lastly, it's important to point out that all the books are not the same. As we'll see, all the books don't necessarily agree with each other. There are different voices. There are different theological perspectives about what's going on and God's role in the world and all those sorts of things. There are different questions that are being asked. We've got some skeptical voices that show up in the Old Testament. We have some very positive voices that are showing up in the Old Testament in terms of God and what God's up to. And I think it's important to note that the Jewish community was okay with all of that. They were okay with the differences, the different voices, because they recognized that there were different voices in their own communities. And so we don't just need one voice saying one thing in every book in the Old Testament, but that we learn something about life and God and faith when there are these different voices, and we're being challenged by things that we hear, and I think that's really important from a Jewish perspective, an ancient Jewish perspective in particular. That really doesn't fit with sort of our, Western post-Enlightenment. Everything's got to be rational. Everything's got to fit. We can't have discord in our voices. We've got to present this unified front, blah, 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 those sorts of things. It's just a very different way of thinking about the world that we bring to the table that the ancient Hebrews did not bring. And we at least need to recognize that as we come to the text. Our questions are not going to be their questions. Our concerns are not their concerns. Our struggles may not be their struggles. So we need to sort of keep our eyes open as we come to the text, to see some of those sorts of things, and not to let them bother us, but to realize that these books were written a world away, and culture is very different, language is very different, experience is very different than our own. And if we're going to try to understand the importance of these stories, we need to recognize some of those differences along the way. Well, friends, I guess our time is about shot. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this. Hopefully, I will not have any trouble getting this up on YouTube, so that you can access it. Again, make sure you got those blanks filled in your PowerPoint. That'll help you as you study come first test time. And we'll see on Friday if there are any questions from this before we move on. But at least wanted to get some of this material out there to you, so that we can try to stay on track as much as we can over the next few days. So anyway, hope you're enjoying your day, and look forward to seeing you on Friday. We're still due to do our seating chart on Friday, so we'll see if we can't get that put into place. And look forward to it. Have a good one. We'll see you soon. Bye bye.